section of the Think Aloud is going to be dealing with the abstract in the introduction. But before I start with the abstract, I want to put this activity into greater context. So what we're going to see, or what you're going to be watching, is an expert, me, reading an article and hearing what I'm thinking along the way. Now, you have a pocket guide to how to read a journal article critically. But the way that experts do it is that they don't necessarily follow that worksheet that you have been given, that pocket guide. Experts often intuitively ask those questions without exactly following that similar order. And so what you're going to be observing in this video is an expert reading the article. Many of the questions that I address are similar to what is in the pocket guide, but they may not be in order of all of the questions that are asked in the pocket guide. I may ask additional questions or notice additional information that is not noted in the pocket guide, but at the same time there may be questions that are in the pocket guide that may or may not be relevant to this particular article. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the abstract. So what we have here is we are looking at the abstract of the fried food consumption and risk of type 2 diabetes and coronary artery disease article by Cahill and several authors from Harvard. And so what I'm just going to do is begin to read the article in silence, and I'll start noting all of the important aspects along the way. Now, just before we start and I highlight all of those important aspects, typically when I read an abstract, important things that I'm looking for are the identification of the exposure and the outcome, how each was measured. I try to identify the sample size and the cohort that was used. I try to identify the types of statistical analyses that were used. That can be informative because it can tell me what type of biases might occur when reading the results. And then finally, I look for the major findings to see what their major findings are. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the abstract. And so as I'm reading here, the frequent consumption of fried foods, so I know here that this is my exposure. And the objective was to see if it was related to long-term cardiometabolic health. And so they didn't specify the exact outcomes of this, but based on the title, remember that we established that the outcomes that they were interested in were type 2 diabetes and coronary artery disease. And if I continue to read the objective, this is confirmed. It's a coronary artery disease. So I know here that my exposure is measured using a questionnaire, and my sample size is 70,842 women from the Nurses' Health Study. Now, as an expert in nutrition epidemiologist, I know a lot about the Nurses' Health Study. It may be that you need to read the method section in more detail to understand what that particular study means. In addition to those 70,000 women, I know that there are a little under 41,000 men from the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. And you can see the time frame in which the study took place. I know that those who participated were free of the outcome at the start of the study. And then, if I continue reading, it tells me a little bit about the methods, Cox proportional hazard models. Again, I don't expect you to know the details of a Cox proportional hazard model, but I know that this means that models were adjusted for other covariates, which may impact the understanding the exposure-outcome relationship. As I moved to the results, I realized that approximately 10,000 individuals developed type 2 diabetes over the study time frame, and that nearly 6,000 individuals developed coronary artery disease. As I'm reading here, so Here again is confirmation that my results were adjusted for these confounders. And those who consumed fried food 1 to 3 times per week, 4 to 6 times per week, or greater than 7 times per week, were a little more likely to experience type 2 diabetes and were a little more likely to experience cardiovascular or coronary artery disease. A risk ratio greater than 1 indicates that the exposure was negatively associated or increased the risk of the development of these types of outcomes. So the authors also indicate that the results were attenuated. What attenuation means is that the results were brought closer to the null, or in layman's terms, that the results between fried food consumption and the risk of developing type 2 diabetes and coronary artery disease were not as strong once you adjusted for these factors. So that is hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, and body mass index. Now, even though it's not explicitly stated in the abstract, in this particular section, the way that the authors have written this, I know that the reason they adjusted for these additional factors is because they were interested in mediation. And what that means is, does fried food consumption lead to type 2 diabetes through the mechanism of, say, hypertension, high lipids, and high body mass index? And those results are, that my assumption about a mediation analysis were confirmed as I continued to read the conclusion. These associations were largely mediated by body weight and comorbid hypertension and hypercholesterolemia. Okay, so now that we're done with the abstract, what I usually do as an expert is I do read the introduction, but I usually read the introduction and I usually skim it. I don't read it quite as closely as I would read the abstract or the methods or results section. I typically read the introduction looking for certain things. So what I typically look for in an introduction, I'm looking for the justification. Why are the authors doing this particular study? I'm looking for, does what the authors want to study between the exposure and outcome relationship, does it make sense? Does it make sense biologically? Does it make sense based on information and research that already exists? And then ultimately I read it to determine the objective. So right here, through the process of oxidation, polymerization, hydrogenation, frying modifies the composition of foods in their frying medium. With repeated use, oils deteriorate, which leads to change in the fatty acid composition and absorption of other oil degradation products into fried foods. And so here, this tells us a little bit about why fried food may be related to my outcomes. And in epidemiology, we refer to this as biological plausibility. In other words, what is the mechanism in which fried food could impact the biology within an individual? Let me go ahead and move to the other side of the introduction. So I'm circling this as well. I also think this represents biological plausibility. And the reason I think that is because the authors are presenting their case as to why oils or the frying medium in which we find fried foods from restaurants may be different than if we fry foods at home. Because typically when we fry foods at home, typically we're using maybe a different type of oil, and maybe we're using that oil for the first time. So there may be some reason and rationale why consuming fried foods in restaurants or away from home may be different, or may have a different effect biologically on us than foods that we fry in our own home. So what this section really is telling me is what the previous literature says. However, to our knowledge, no prospective study has specifically quantified the association between fried food consumption and type 2 diabetes. So even there has been significant research suggesting that should be a relationship between oils and fried food consumption and risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, or particularly coronary artery disease. What this is particularly saying is there is a gap in the literature. So even though we know there may be a reason for this relationship, there is still a gap. There's still unknown information, and so therefore the researchers thought this was a valuable study to conduct. And the last sentence tells us the objective of the study. We aim to examine prospectively whether the frequency of fried food consumption, both at home and away from home, is associated with the risk of incident type 2 diabetes or coronary artery disease. At this point, it is my suspicion about why they were talking about biological plausibility, about differences in frying from home, away from home, and at home, is confirmed because they are going to be examining whether they consumed it, the frequency of fried food consumption at home and away from home.